Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from Rouse IAS. The many challenges of WTO. So recently a good news has arrived because for the first time in its 25-year history, the World Trade Organization will be led by a woman. And the reason for that is that both of the contending candidates for the Director General post are women. One is from Nigeria and another one is from South Korea respectively. So obviously a new Director General is about to arrive on arena, and we know that for any organization, the first and the foremost priority should be dealing with the issues plaguing that organization. And in this regard, the author has published the article highlighting few of the important challenges being faced by the WTO. Now, why is it important for civil services examination? Now, if you have seen the syllabus of GS paper 2, you must have seen an important line. Important international institutions, agencies and fora, their structure, mandate. And so in this regard, not just for the prelims examination, obviously this is important for that, but from the perspective of mains examination, there are few things which are very important. And so in this regard, we will start by first understanding why is there a need for such an international organization. Why in the backdrop of World War II, a need was felt for that, GATT was created, and then finally WTO took it from there. So we'll understand the basics of WTO, its advantages, and then finally we will look into the challenges currently being faced by WTO. Now starting with the basics, because most of our viewers are quite new and for them it is very important to understand how and why it was created. So before WTO there existed a GATT or General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It more or less functioned on the same lines, which was created in 1948 to regulate world trade. And it was created as a means to boost economic recovery after Second World War by reducing and eliminating trade tariffs, quotas and subsidies. So during the Great Depression, a breakdown of international relations and an increase in trade regulation made poor economic condition even worse, and it contributed to the outbreak of Second World War. And just as the war finished, Allies believed that a multilateral framework for the world trade would loosen the protectionist policies that defined 1930s. Now, what are the protectionist policies and what are these tariffs and quotas and subsidies? So these are a way to carry out protectionism, which is a practice of following protectionist state policy, which allows for the government of a country to promote its own domestic producers, service providers, and thereby boost their domestic production of goods and services. For example, let's say if there is a government contract, and if Government of India mandates that only Indian companies can bid for that contract, that is a kind of protectionism. Similarly, let's say that Government of India puts a limit on how much cars can be imported, let's say 100 per year, that is a quota. Similarly, Government of India can impose, let's say 100% import duty on a lot of products, and that is tariff. Or in other ways, the Government of India can provide domestic producer of cars 50% rebate in, let's say, iron and steel. And so that is a subsidy. And so all these kinds of measures are called protectionist policies. So the taxes or duties imposed on imports are known as tariffs. Restriction on the volume of import are known as quotas. And negative taxes or tax credits are known as subsidies. So these are the three main ways of providing protection. And let us understand them by an image which you can see on your screen. So these are tariffs. Then government provides subsidies, which allows producers to lower the price of local goods and services because they are getting benefits from the government. Then you impose quotas. And then no matter how low a fee sets the price through subsidies, it cannot ship more goods because there is a limit on how much you can import. And even if that good is very cheap, you cannot import more than that. And then finally, you tweak with the currency. Deliberate attempt by a country to lower its currency value, which would make its exports cheaper and more competitive. So in the build-up of World War II, most developed countries across the world increasingly resorted to these four methods, and because of which the global trade was suffering, because protectionism has its own fair share of disadvantages. Of course, it offers more growth opportunity, lower imports, more jobs and higher GDP for the local population or for the residents of the country. But in the longer term, it is not good for any economy. Why? Because first and foremost, it leads to stagnation of technological advancement. As domestic producers don't need to worry about foreign competition, they have no incentive to innovate or spend resources on R&D of new products. Similarly, there is very limited choice for consumers. If you ask your parents about the choices they had about electronics goods or even cars, they would tell you that they were not available because consumers have access to fewer goods in a market as a result of limitations on how much foreign goods can be imported because of protectionist policies. There is increase in prices due to lack of competition. Consumers will need to pay more without seeing any significant improvement in the product. And since there are very less number of choices, consumer has to choose what is available. And finally, it leads to economic isolation. Because there are high tariffs, there are quotas, and there are subsidies given to local markets and local producers, that country or that economy becomes to grow increasingly distant from other economies, and so the exchange of ideas is minimum, and which leads to not just economic but also political and cultural isolation. Just try to think of North Korea when you talk about protectionism. It's just not economically isolated but also culturally and politically. And so that is why a need was felt to create an organization which would counter protectionism, would liberalize trade by reducing tariffs and removing quotas among member countries. This will not just counter protectionism but increase in global trade, which would then boost the war-ravaged economy of World War II scenario. And so in this context, GATT was thought of. Ultimately, it was taken over by WTO later on, but this is the context in which WTO works. So far, we have understood why it is important to have a global institution working towards a global trade or a rule-based trading system. So some important aspects of WTO is that it was established in 1995, or rather it took over or changed its form from GATT to WTO, and it is a successor of that, and it deals just not with goods, which was the main emphasis of GATT, but it deals with services, intellectual property, dispute settlement, as well as trade monitoring. An important aspect is that it is not a specialized agency of United Nations. Although it has an arrangement with the United Nations through which it maintains strong relation with United Nations. So this is a very important information. And so WTO functions for smooth, free and predictable global trade, or for the creation of free trade, which is a policy that means governments do not charge people to import or bring in goods from other countries or make exporter pay taxes to send their goods abroad. Because you need to understand that when companies invest in other countries, they want the trading rules to not change suddenly in their disadvantage. And for that, they need protection. And so that framework is provided by WTO. And so it is important for us to understand and appreciate the advantages which are derived from WTO. So first and foremost is that it talks about a gradual reduction of tariffs. As you can clearly see the example of United States on your screen. On your y-axis we have tariffs as a percentage of imports, and on x-axis you have years. And if you start looking from 1940, you can clearly see a gradual reduction in the import duties imposed by United States. And similar is the case with other countries as well. And so it talks about gradual reduction of tariffs and through which it wants to promote free trade. Then it acts as a legal framework, not just for negotiation of countries or among them, but also for other kinds of trade barriers as well. Then it enables trade without any discrimination, and it is not like that WTO is just a body vouching for free trade or completely free trade, which means no tariffs, no barriers, no quotas, nothing. It allows for tariffs and trade restrictions under certain conditions. For example, if a country A feels that a country B is exporting very cheap raw material which is artificially deflated, then the country A can impose duties without violating WTO rules. Similarly, there are clauses such as national security which a country can utilize to impose significant barriers to trade for a specific country. And then finally, all these rules are to protect fair competition because there are rules which member countries have to abide by. Whether it is about subsidies or contracts or import or export, once you become a member of WTO, your national rules have to align by the general framework. And so that is how the disadvantages of protectionism are countered. It leads to lower prices for consumers because then imports become cheaper. It promotes fair trade because then foreign companies can function in any of the countries which are member and can expect a fair treatment from the government. Then it leads to specialization because when all companies are treated equally, then the companies can produce a product anywhere across the world. And that location is mainly decided by the factor of manufacturing cost and not other policies like quotas and tariffs and other barriers. And finally, it leads to the development of economies of scale. Because by encouraging free trade, firms can specialize and produce higher quantity. This enables even more economies of scale, which is important for industries, especially in the current context. And the success of WTO is demonstrated by the raw data. WTO has over 160 members representing 98% of world trade. There has been an increase in the trade dispute which have been brought to WTO, showing that WTO indeed has become a forum to help resolve these disputes. Also, WTO regulations have helped avoid a major trade war. And finally, let's see the data. So on your screen, this graph shows world exports as a percentage of GDP. So on the y-axis, you have exports of goods and services as a percentage of GDP, and on x-axis, you have timeline, and you can clearly see an increasing trend throughout. So this clearly shows increasing global trade in last 50 years since the time a global rule-based order was established in global trade. Despite all its advantages, there are some issues, and they are significant ones. There are a lot of areas where WTO has been severely criticized. On one hand, it is true that it has led to counter protectionism, but on the other hand, it is also true that it has given rise to inequalities, not just in terms of wealth, but also in terms of industrial and other kinds of development. Let us understand how. So first and foremost criticism of WTO is that it is unfavorable to developing nations because it is derived from GATT, which was established in the context of World War II, and all the victors and the global north came together to frame a rule which was very beneficial to them. For example, let's take the case of tariff protection. This is the way which was resorted to by developed countries during the time of Industrial Revolution. They utilized heavy import duties to stop the import of goods from foreign countries. US did it to exclude Germany, Germany did it to exclude Britain, and each one of them did for each other. They utilized these tariff and quotas to grow their economy. And now once they are developed, they have access to technology, they have access to capital, and now they want developing countries to significantly reduce their tariff barriers. They want India to significantly reduce and continuously lower their import duties. And so we know that countries like India and other countries do not have industrial base. And at that point of time, if the import duty is significantly reduced, it leads to the import of cheaper products from foreign countries, and then which further deters the industrial growth. And the second reason why it is unfavorable to developing nations is the categorization of most favored nation by WTO. So under WTO agreement, countries cannot normally discriminate between their trading partners. So for example, they cannot grant someone a special favor such as a lower custom duty or rate, and if you do it for one, you will have to do it for others as well. So what does that mean? That means that if India is providing special treatment to a third country A, it will have to provide the same treatment to company from USA, a company from China. And that is a problem because companies from USA and China are pretty strong, right? Negotiating at WTO or any of its meetings require a very high level of specialized and technical knowledge of not just the law, but also about nuances of trade and economy, which developing countries generally do not have. And since they do not have that kind of human resource which can negotiate on their behalf, more often than not, the agreements, especially for African countries, are designed against them. And of course, when it is unfavorable to developing countries, in more aspects, it is favorable to developing nations. Because the way negotiations have been designed or the way agreements work, they enable various kinds of protection. And these protections are applicable only for developed countries. Let's take the Agreement on Agriculture, which is the framework which governs the farm subsidies of WTO, which is the agreement of WTO which governs the farm subsidies. It has categorized the farm subsidies into trade distorting domestic subsidies and non-trade distorting subsidies. So all those subsidies which are trade distorting shall have to be eliminated, whereas all which are not trade distorting can go on. So all trade distorting subsidies are categorized under amber box, whereas non-trade distorting subsidies are categorized under blue and green boxes. And so under WTO, these are allowed. An interesting fact is that most developed nations provide their farmers with the kinds of subsidies which are categorized under this box, whereas the way India or the way other developing nations provide subsidies to their farmers have been categorized under trade distorting, and it is a pressure on them to put an end or at least reduce these subsidies, which of course is in favor of developed nations. Then recently, there has been a push for change in definition of developing country under the principle of special and differential treatment. So which talks about upgrading certain developing countries from the status of developing. And this is going to deeply impact not just India, but many other countries like China, Egypt, Turkey, as well as South Africa. And the reason behind this is that there is an assumption that these countries have benefited immensely from WTO rules since its formation in 1995. And there is also a belief that these countries have progressed enough that they should not be getting benefits of a developing country. And so that is also going to act in favor of developed nations. Then a very important and a good thing about WTO is that all decisions are made on consensus. There is no concept of voting, and unless and until all the members agree to a particular agreement, that shall not come into force. That is a good thing, but that itself has become the biggest roadblock in the progress of WTO. Since the members of WTO are clearly divided between developed, or you can say global north versus global south, there has been a lack of development on any of the major agreements in last 20 years. And there is a fragmentation among countries. So for example, developed countries want to push their agenda with respect to rules on e-commerce, investment, intellectual property rights. But exactly on these agenda, developing countries are quite reluctant. Similarly, developing countries want to push for reform of agreement on agriculture, which developed countries are not interested because they already are having a lot of benefits from that. Then there are other issues as well. For example, Agreement on Trade Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, or acronymed as TRIPS, which is an international legal agreement between all the member nations of WTO with respect to rules regarding protection of intellectual property rights. For example, protection of patents, copyrights, logos and various other such creations for companies from one country into another. It establishes minimum standards for regulation by national governments of different forms of IP. And it has been mainly criticized by developing countries because of its discriminatory nature. Because it is discriminatory in nature. Why is it discriminatory? Because most of the intellectual properties are owned by countries which belong to developed world. And now they want to sell their products in developing countries but want their IPRs to be protected at the same level as they are protected in developed countries. And now this is leading to creation of artificial scarcity of products, which can be okay in some cases but cannot be good in various fields. For example, in medical fields, in pharmaceuticals. Let's take an example of a medicine. Let's say if India has weak IPR laws and if a company somehow manages to develop the same medicine which is being sold in America and it starts the manufacturing. That is not possible right now, but at least it is going to save a lot of lives. But with imposition of strict TRIPS laws, only company A, which originally manufactured that medicine, is allowed to sell products in the developing countries as well. Then the next issue arises from dispute resolution mechanism of WTO. Dispute settlement system, or DSS, is a mechanism to resolve trade dispute between and among member states. The members of DSS are also appointed by consensus, and so if one of the member blocks the appointment, it shall become dysfunctional, and it has become dysfunctional since 2019 because of lot of trouble being created by United States, which has led to very low number of judges to produce rulings. There are just not enough judges to produce rulings, and it has led to a huge backlog of cases pending in DSS. And finally, when the countries grow very powerful, they start resorting to unilateral tariffs. If you are reading newspaper, you must have read that in past 2 to 3 years, how China and USA have unilaterally imposed various kinds of tariffs on each other products without paying heed to the rules and procedures of WTO. Similarly, in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic, many countries including India have resorted to protectionism despite WTO in existence. So clearly you can understand that challenges in front of WTO are not small. There are mega challenges which the new Director General would have to face. So in this regard, in this discussion, we started by first understanding the context in which the parent body or the predecessor of WTO was formed, that is GATT. That context was extreme protectionism, to counter which a GATT was established, which then passed on the baton to WTO. Then we understood what advantages have been arrived, how it has worked in favor of increasing the global trade, but nonetheless it has its fair share of challenges and issues which needs to be resolved pretty soon.